2016, that is from 2009 to 2016, I was part of a law firm. I rose to become the youngest associate partner in March 2015, by which time I developed a fair reputation as someone who could argue in court without the need for a senior. By which time my opposing counsels had said, if you were not part of a firm, we'd start engaging you for arguments. So by 2016 is when I decided to quit and go independent. Now, as long as you're part of another outfit, it's very difficult for you to take positions because the organization will pay the price for your positions. And particularly if they happen to be politically incorrect positions and you're fairly vocal about it, they may or may not agree. But without blaming them for anything, the fact of the matter is I decided to prove myself exclusively on the anvils of professional commitments for the first 7 years. People should know me for my professional competence before they know me for my opinions, was my approach to it. Because every Tom, Dick and Harry can have an opinion, so what? Why should people hear you? Why should people pay attention to what you're saying? They will listen to you provided you have done something, you have something to show for. And therefore the strategy, very clear strategy, at least a calculated one, was establish yourself and then you start talking on the subject. So for close to 7 years, I spent my time keeping my mouth shut, keeping my head down, proving myself exclusively as a competent commercial litigator in the Delhi High Court. 2016 June is when I went independent as an independent arguing counsel, which is in the mold of a barrister, wherein you don't interact with the client. Your sole job is to argue in court. You don't file, you don't draft, you just argue. So your clients are other lawyers who want you to argue, and the actual client is the client of that lawyer. So the client is in a relationship with the solicitor, who is the one who prepares the matter. The solicitor engages the barrister to argue in court. So I happen to be in the arguing mold. So that's the practice model that I jumped to, because by then I'd already established a reputation as someone who could fairly argue in court. Around that time, the Sabarimala case was raging before a 3-judge bench. And the 3-judge bench was asking itself whether this matter is serious enough for it to be referred to a 5-judge bench. And therefore arguments were going on, I think, between October 2016 and February 2017 before the 3-judge bench. There is one organization called People for Dharma, which was looking for lawyers who could take up their cause pro bono. Now, they didn't have access to me, I didn't have access to them. Neither of us knew of the other's existence. Someone on social media, later that person met me and revealed his identity, put out a message to them, a public tweet in fact, that if you're looking for someone who will fight this cause passionately, regardless of any commercial incentive, go to this guy because he's serious about these things. Now, I don't know how that person had read this about me from a distance, but that's how they said it. That's how the opportunity landed on my table. And when the opportunity landed on my table, I realized, with growing awareness and concern, that Bharat had achieved a certain unfortunate stage where all the institutions that inform its identity and civilization will now have to prove their worth before constitutional courts as to how their practices are constitutional. Religious practices and traditions that have survived and that have existed for thousands of years will now be tested on the anvils of the Constitution in front of an Anglophone audience. And traditional practices will now have to be conveyed and packaged in English for them to understand whether it is constitutional or not. Now remember, all these people, just like us, at least most of us, are people who have gone through an English education system, with or without any traditional exposure to our customs and traditions. Or even if there is exposure, there is a decent chance that they look down upon those traditions. So this is not a primary audience of children in schools, it's not a secondary audience of people in colleges, it's a tertiary audience with a lived experience of constantly having looked down upon their culture for 30 years or 40 years. And you're trying to convince them in a span of a week or so that this practice is not misogynistic, that this practice is perfectly valid. Ask yourself a simple question. Somebody brings their life experience to their jobs, and you're hoping to argue against their life experience and their worldview in a span of a few hours, trying to convince them as to why this practice must continue. Genuinely speaking, I didn't think we had any hopes of success. No hopes of success. You can't even convince children today of your customs. How can you hope to convince adults with set egos and set patterns of thinking who occupy those positions which obviously give them a certain degree of importance? There is no incentive for them to be convinced otherwise, to be persuaded otherwise. But why was the representation still necessary? The representation was necessary because if you don't vocally express your point of view, it is as good as that point of view not existing. People will therefore say, there is no alternative point of view. There is no alternative opinion. So sometimes, even if it happens to be a losing battle at the outset, at least in round one, your job is to continue hitting and kicking the door to try and pry that door open for your point of view. So knowing fully well that the odds were stacked against us, and when I mean we, it's a huge team of, let's say, a variety of lawyers. Perhaps I was the youngest to argue in that particular matter. Everyone put their best foot forward. If you had legends like Mr. Satish Parasaran, including Dr. Singhvi was arguing from this side, for God's sakes. Dr. Singhvi argued for the Travancore Devaswam board, defending the tradition on behalf of the temple in defense of the practice. A host of voices, some of the most stellar voices produced by the Indian legal fraternity, did argue from this side and still managed to come out only with a 4-1 verdict, one opinion in your favor, 4 against you. And the one person to deliver a verdict in your favor happened to be a lady in the cause which is supposed to be about women. The dissenting opinion in favor of the tradition came from a lady. And the men were saviors of women in that cause. This is unfortunately how contemporary feminism works, where men become more feminist than women themselves. And in the process, what happened was, there was a moment of churn created. Allow me to say this, everything that has happened since 2018, especially since the birth of the Sabarimala movement, has only led to a rising Hindu consciousness. Before 2018, not many people had heard the words Naishthika Brahmacharya. People in the north of Vindhyas, several parts of that country had no knowledge of this particular temple, despite Russians, Argentinians and Brazilians coming to this temple with proper Diksha. Any number of videos put out by foreigners basically saying, we understand this, why can't you Hindus and Indians understand it? That was the extent of the problem. But sometimes I think these challenges are moments of learning and moments of churn, because they pry open the conversation from a confined box, and the entire Pandora's box is opened. Gender, jati, temple, everything comes out. And then people start thinking, okay, what do we actually know about this particular subject for us to have such strong opinions on? People started revisiting. From there, in 2018, when the first negative verdict came out, so many people who had written off Keralites and Malayalis as communists who were irredeemable and incorrigible, the women of Kerala took out processions in defense of the temple, thereby establishing that political choices and religious beliefs need not necessarily coincide. They could be different. And that possibility was out for people to see. So the educated women of the most literate state of the country came out on the streets protesting against a verdict which was apparently meant to liberate women in defense of a practice that was apparently misogynistic. Look at the irony of it. And they said, we know this practice better than you think we do. You don't need to come and save us. We can defend ourselves. There are better things for you to defend us against, not this. If at all you would really wish to intervene and protect us, there are other serious issues. This is luxury litigation. People who are utterly jobless or whose only job is to take pot shots at Hindu institutions are the ones who are behind it, and who constantly think that Hindu institutions must be in a perpetual mode of reform and everything that they know and practice for the last 1,000 years must be junked and discarded. That seems to be the motive behind it. So it was a moment of learning, because It opened my eyes to how little I knew about an institution of which I thought I knew some. What is the meaning of this practice? How is it supposed to be observed? All the myths associated with the Sabarimala Diksha I had to unlearn. And I was put in touch with a brilliant set of people who were vastly more qualified than I am, and I was, or I will be ever, on the subject of Dharma, who decided to download all their knowledge upon me, giving me the opportunity to present this before a court of law. Perhaps what I'm trying to do is to say that it was not a solo act. I just happened to be a glorified articulator and messenger of their opinions and their points of view before the highest forum of the land. And the credit must go to all those people who were behind the scenes. I also walked away with the glory partly because of social media representation, and the fact of the matter is a lot of Ayyappa Diksha, Bhaktas, withstood lathi blows on the ground. I didn't have to face a single lathi blow, right? Two, my star argument of the deity's rights came from a boy younger than I and a non-lawyer. His name is Tarun Daga. He was part of the team. He basically said, if women have rights, doesn't the deity have rights? That was the seed of the argument. And I then thought about it. So the strength of a lawyer need not be that he is the origin of an idea. He must just be open to ideas, and then he must know how to build an argument out of it and to develop that argument further. That's what happened. From there, I went to the next experience, which was the Padmanabha Swami temple case, where I happened to represent the chief tantri of the temple. And then I realized what kind of a relationship did princely states of Bharat have with their deities. Mysore, Chamundeshwari; Jagannath, therefore the Gajapati of Odisha; Mewad, Eklingji; then Cochin, I think Purnatraisha. So every princely state seems to have its own deity, and every princely family, when it negotiated its accession with the Indian state, primarily was saying, take everything else away, but leave our rights with respect to our deities intact. Because this is our hereditary institution. If you break this relationship, there will be real consequences for us. The fear of karmic consequences was very, very real for them. And so if you go through the negotiations, I think the right-hand man of Vallabhbhai Patel, who wrote a book on the integration of states and who released the white paper on how integration must happen, captures it brilliantly as to how these parties negotiated with the Indian state. And then I said, okay, if 90% of the princely states were Hindu princely states, and the basis of the partition was a division between Hindu princely states and Muslim princely states, how did Hindu princely states come together to come out with a non-Hindu Bharat? How is that possible? So each of the parts have very clear religious allegiance. But apparently the unit that they form is a secular unit which has no religious identity at all. Is this what they negotiated for? How does this even work? That explains the absence of the word secularism partly in the original constitution. Because they were all participants and stakeholders to how the constitution will be framed, because it would have a bearing on their surviving rights after the accession, including the religious rights. How do you call this a secular constitution if it has a specific provision for protection of the cow? If it has a specific article, Article 295A, under which the Union of India from the Consolidated Fund of India continues to pay an annual rent to the Padmanabha Swami temple for the lands that it has taken from the temple. So temple payment is made out from an apparently secular constitution. How do you explain this? Which is why I believe it's important for us to understand the entry of secularism into the Indian constitution very, very clearly. For all practical purposes, it was pushed and forced into the draft, or rather into the body of the document, only during the emergency. So those who wish to bat for the constitution and its integrity and whatnot have a lot to answer for, because this concept and this principle was inserted in the constitution during the most unconstitutional period of Bharat, when for all practical purposes all checks and balances were in a state of animated suspension. So how do you then constantly bat for secularism? That is a question of fact, that is a question of history that needs a very clear answer. Even the most hardcore of Hindu voices somehow are wedded to the concept of secularism without realizing what its origins are and its devastating, catastrophic effect on the civilization as a whole. Now, how do we understand secularism in Bharat? It says, the state has no religious identity. The state shall maintain an equidistance from all religions and all faiths. And the state shall never use its funds, which are supposed to be secular funds, for the promotion of any particular faith or any institution of any particular faith. In your lived experience, has Bharat done any of these? The answer is a no. So either the definition of secularism in this country is a khichdi, or we are fundamentally a hypocritical state. These are only two possible conclusions that I can come out with. Now, the consequence of insertion of secularism in the context of Bharat has been a large-scale, wholesale brainwashing of the entire population, which has the effect of telling the population that it shall never have the right to proudly wear the civilizational identity of this country on its sleeve. I've said this before, I'll say it again. Secularism is a political evangelical tool whose job is to sever your roots between you and your past, as a state, as a society, as a country. What they will do is that it's a river called secularism. They'll take you to that river, ask you to dunk in that river, and then your baptism is done. And thanks to that baptism, you're now secular Hindus. Morons who are oxymorons, or oxymorons who are morons. So, according to me, secularism is that particular water body to which we are all taken to convert and come out with a lens which is completely brainwashed. What is the origin of this word? What is the origin of this concept? I've written about this, but before me, stalwarts have written about this extensively. So whatever they've written, I'll just summarize it in 15 minutes so that you have a clear picture. Around the 12th or the 13th century in Europe, long ago, not so long ago, whenever long ago, the point is around 12th century, when there was only one denomination of the church, which is Catholicism in Europe, the relationship between the church and the rulers was an extremely tense relationship. Because the church effectively is based on the doctrine that human existence is divided into two kingdoms, kingdom of the earth and kingdom of heaven. The church has monopoly over kingdom of heaven. Rulers are allowed to rule the kingdom of earth. But since earth is subservient to heaven, the ruler is subservient to the church. Therefore, a tussle goes on for close to 3 to 4 centuries between the church and Christian rulers, not just rulers, Christian rulers. During this entire period, what happens is that kings try to take over the property of the church to control its ability to interfere with administration. Hid money as much as possible so that the church's ability to comment on administration comes down, so that the power that they wield over society comes down. And then the church also does a few things wherein apologies, confessions are sold for money. So a general, let's say, frustration or angst against the church as an institution starts building in European society. That gradually leads to the Reformation movement with Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King Jr., but Martin Luther, who is the founder of the Lutheran brand of denomination of Christians, and who are mostly, if you see Lutheran denomination, you'll find it in Germany for God knows for what reason. So he begins a movement of reformation where he challenges the monopoly of the church. When he starts challenging the monopoly of the church, he then comes out with a protest against Catholicism, which results in the Protestant movement. A protest against the manner in which the Catholic Church operates, controls all religious aspects, and basically says you shall not have access to salvation unless and until you go through the church, specifically the Catholic Church. He tries to break that monopoly of the Catholic Church on salvation and all other aspects of religious behavior as well as non-religious behavior. That Reformation movement results in several Christian states of Europe choosing sides, some choosing the Catholic Church's side and some choosing the Protestant side. Results in a huge fight, multiple treaties, and the final treaty is what we know as the Treaty of Westphalia. So the Treaty of Westphalia was not some kind of a political treaty, it was fundamentally a religious treaty wherein the monopoly of the Catholic Church over Christianity was completely broken. And for the first time, the treaty recognized that Christianity shall henceforth have two denominations, Catholicism and Protestantism. Now, once you do this, the concept of separation of the church and the state comes from that treaty, which is to say, the Catholic Church will not interfere with the rights of individual European rulers to decide whether they want to be parts of Catholic Christianity or Protestant Christianity. So therefore, separation of the church from the state is basically, it still retains the Christian character. It only says the Catholic Church will not tell us whether we should be Catholics or Protestants. And the ruler of each European state will have the power to decide whether he wants to be on the Catholic side or on the Protestant side. But the concept of secularism in Europe never meant give up Christianity. That the state shall have no identity. The state shall have a Christian identity, the ruler shall be a Christian. The only difference is whether he would be a Catholic Christian or a Protestant was the distinction. Compare that with what we are being told about secularism in Bharat. European secularism translates to retention of the Christian identity. It only says you will remain equidistant from denominations. Why? If you happen to have a Protestant minority population in a Catholic majority state, then there must be safeguards to protect the interest of those denominational minorities. And therefore, the majority-minority concept in terms of protection of the rights of the minority is to be traced to that particular situation where minority Protestants had to protect themselves against majority Catholics and vice versa. However, the existence of a minority Catholic in a Protestant majority state would not require the state to give up its Protestant majoritarian identity and vice versa. So they were entitled to have their own identities. And I'll give you a simple comparison. Think of it as fights, let's say a fight between Vaishnavites and Shaivites. If the king happened to be a Shaivite and you had a minority Vaishnavite population, he would have to safeguard their rights, but that doesn't mean he would have to give up his own Shaivite affiliation. And he would still be a Hindu king, but with a Shaivite identity, who basically says, I will employ laws in such a way that they're equidistant from both sects. This is not Dharma Nirpekshata, it is Pantha Nirpekshata. Dharma Nirpekshata means I don't have an identity, I am equally distant from different religious identities. Pantha Nirpekshata means I have a religious identity, but I'm equally distant from the Vaishnavite and the Shaivite. Secularism, when exported to Bharat, like every other European export to colonized societies, was meant to divide the society and to prepare it for ultimate conversion. Secularism is the intermediate step before you give up your religious identity altogether. And this is a documented, intended, let's say, strategy that they themselves say in their correspondence. Why is it that the definition of Europe of secularism in the mothership, which is Europe, allows them to retain their national religious identities, but when it is exposed to countries like Bharat, it results in countries like Bharat having to give up their civilizational identities and religious identities? Why? Which is why I use the words consciously, the myth of secularism, because what has been perpetrated on us is a mithya, which has got nothing to do with the original story of secularism in the mothership, namely Europe. So the next time someone says secularism means separation of the church from the state, please ask that blessed idiot to explain why does it speak of church and the state? Why not any other institution? Why does this concept speak of the church? Because the history of secularism is the history of the church. Hence the words separation of the church and the state. Second, the other compromise that was struck between the rulers and the church as part of this principle was, since the territory of the church will be separate from the territory of the king in terms of the jurisdictions, the king shall never be allowed to appropriate property of the church. In this country, what it is translated to is the appropriation of temple property by the secular Indian state. So it was meant to ensure that the king shall never have the right to interfere with the financial independence and autonomy of the church. It has taken the exact opposite consequence in this country. For all practical purposes, we are glorified Macaulay Putras and Putris who have zero understanding of how these concepts have devastated our society fully and entrenched unnecessary concepts in the heart of the society, hopefully not forever. And idiots on social media fight on saying, you are secular, I am pseudo-secular and ulta. Don't give up the concept altogether. Because secularism in its truest form and definition is incompatible with Hindu philosophy. It is incompatible with Hindu ethos. It is incompatible with Hindu administration. Because Hindu governance is based on the concept of Rita and Dharma. The king is seen as the torchbearer of Dharma. The king is effectively seen as the one who will advance the cause of Dharma. And Dharma can take a religious connotation, it can take a spiritual connotation, it can take a political connotation. So it can become Raja Dharma, or it can become even Sanatana Dharma. But Raja Dharma is also to be traced only from Sanatana Dharma. There is no way you can divorce or dissociate the two. When someone says that Bharat should embrace secularism, it effectively means Dharma's position in politics and policy making should be completely dislodged. Whereas every other country which subscribes to a particular religious identity gets to fashion its laws on the basis of its religious beliefs except us. So 52 countries with an Islamic identity can source their laws and their beliefs and policy from Sharia and the Quran. Christians can do that. You still have kingdoms, monarchs in Europe. Whereas we abolished princely states, completely insulted them by abolishing even privy purses, forced them to sell their property, forced them to rent out their ancestral lands. How many know that close to about 126 temples in Tanjavur are still controlled by the descendants of the Maratha Empire? There is a Bhosle who is still responsible for 126 temples in Tanjavur. He doesn't go around in a Benz, he goes around in a scooter. The head of such a great Samsthanam goes around in a scooter. The Pandalam family a couple of generations ago had to work hard to make ends meet. And what are we constantly told about our princely states? That they were collaborators, that they managed to keep our way of life alive when they knew it was extremely difficult to defeat the British because that was the largest colonizing empire ever known in history. So they did what they could to strike a compromise with him and still preserve our way of life and our institutions is lost on us. All of this because we have purchased distorted European ideals lock, stock, and barrel without asking, is it relevant to me? Does it apply to me? What are its consequences for my identity? That's the fundamental question we should have asked. The unfortunate reality today is that even those institutions and organizations which are supposedly guardians of Hindutva and Hindu Dharma also swear by the very same devastating concepts without changing the definition or without asking whether it is applicable remotely or not. With no intention to embarrass anyone, my only suggestion is when it comes to some of these issues, try not to get sucked into the social media battles of BJP versus Congress. Think for yourself. Because it's such a non-productive, useless conversation. Because it sets such a low bar for the conversation with no original thought possible. Because both sides agree on certain issues. They may only point out each other's hypocrisy, whereas I am basically saying we should not be accepting certain rules of the game which have been taken for granted. Instead of asking who is more secular, we should start asking why secular. Let's have an open debate on the subject. Why secular? What is its impact? And it extends to a host of other values. I am not here trying to take pot shots at any organization. I am only trying to say, since you have taken the interest and the initiative to attend a lecture on such a boring topic, I am assuming that you're open to slightly more different points of view than the standard Congress versus BJP trope. Because I am sick and tired of it. I am done with it. It is way past the sell by date. We are consuming expired goods, which can lead to nothing good. So focus on three things. What is good for our civilization? What is good for that identity which informs the identity of the civilization? Who is doing a better job of protecting that particular identity? Are they doing it enough? Can we push them to do better? Those are the only questions which according to me are relevant. Everything else is hogwash. And everything else is white noise meant to keep you occupied and away from the actual problems. Sure, at the time of elections, at the time of hustings, we all have our choices. And there you never get to make an ideal choice. You're like bad, better, worst, or bad, better, worst. So that's the hierarchy of, let's say, virtue in this country at this point, politically speaking. So there you go for the least harmful option, in the hope that you can at least push them to do something. Because the other side has clearly said, I am here to destroy you, I'm going to adopt a scorched earth policy. Even that fellow doesn't realize that he is committing political suicide when there is an empty field open to protect Hindu identity openly. Right now, the political option of an unabashed, let's say, representative of Hindu security and Hindu interest is lying on the table like free money, unclaimed. But he is anyway given up because he is obviously controlled by external motivations and sources. So when you start discussing these concepts, for a moment, keep the political lens aside and focus on something deeper. And two, the purpose of introducing decolonization as part of our discourse is to question everything that we have taken for granted till date since 1835, when that blessed English education system was inserted into our consciousness to brainwash us over the years. You have to realize what they said when they introduced that system. Forget the so-called Macaulay dialogue that people keep quoting and citing. That's irrelevant. There's actually something deeper. They realized after multiple battles that the one aspect of Bharatiya society that they must not touch is religion. Because you can take over our resources, you can do whatever you want. The moment you touch religion, you will get a bloody nose. 1857 proved it even further. So between 1835 and 1857, they had multiple such experiences, and then they realized this community will resist immediate forced conversion because they've been fighting that brand of forced conversion for 800 years before that. So we have resisted the sword openly, so therefore we are comfortable picking up the sword to resist the sword. And therefore they start a slow poison, which will take effect over generations. Like time bombs that will explode, where Hindus themselves will stand outside universities protesting against CAA, against NRC, idiots of the first order. And that bomb is exploding almost 150 years after it was set in motion. You're trying to protect your present while your future is standing up against you. And when this happens, they are hoping remain Hindus, but remain Hindus on paper only. Only for legal purposes you'll remain Hindu, because by the time you're out of this laundry, which I call the English education system, the Indian education system, we would have brainwashed you properly. Hindu, 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 weak Hindu, weak Hindu, weak Hindu. I am not a Hindu, I hate Hindu. Stages of conversion. So it's only a matter of time. And therefore, the word Hindu at this point, if I had to take a head count of practicing Hindus, we are not even 800 million according to me, because the test is how many of us would defend our religious institutions with conviction. And I wouldn't peg the number at more than 50% of 800 million, leaving us at only 40 crores. That's a very, I know, I understand it's a fairly alarming assessment, but based on my experience, I don't think the number is beyond 50% of the total number on paper. And when conversations happen about reclaiming our spaces, if the conversation had taken place in 1850s, there would be no room for negotiation or compromise. Today, the ones who are saying, give us all our occupied sites back, and this legislation that stands in the way of legitimate reclamation of occupied sites are being called extremists, not by others, but by Hindus themselves, proving that the education system has done its job. That the slow time bomb has clearly exploded properly. 40,000 sites at best is a number within the broken, truncated, moth-eaten Bharat that you see today. But if you start from Afghanistan till Bangladesh and you compare the total number of temples that have been destroyed, 40,000 is an underplayed number. Completely underplayed number. How many Jyotirlingas have been lost and how many Shaktipeeths have been lost is a simple calculation you start with, and then you look at every other temple possible. Mulastan becomes Multan, Ajmer becomes Ajmer. You have all these names, and still you think 40,000 is a huge number. It's such a huge number, it can come only from the mouth of a rabid Hindutva extremist such as Deepak. Sorry, the reality is, despite going through the laundry, I have not been whitewashed yet. I have managed to retain that germ a bit more, for God knows for whatever reason. But you will realize as you read history that if there is a community that has allowed itself to be colonized over decades post-independence, the stellar textbook example will be that of the Hindu community. So what you have done in 1947 is given yourself a paper independence, which is why it is Swarajya, which is self-rule, but not Swatantra, which is ruled by your own principles. So today we are Swarajya, but we certainly are not Swatantra by any yardstick. Because you're ashamed of your policies, you're ashamed of your past, you don't have the guts to implement any of your political thoughts or your administrative thoughts in action. They're only relegated to ornamental speeches about how great we are and how we are the founders of democracy. That's it. And the one document that is constantly being cited against you to say that if you take such a position, you are taking an anti-constitutional position, therefore happens to be the Constitution itself. Hence, the efforts to understand, is the Constitution fundamentally pitted against my civilization? Or over the years, has it been interpreted in such a way that it appears pitted against my civilization? Is there a problem with Gangotri? Or is there a problem with Ganga flowing in Noida? By the time it passes through the plains, has it become dirty? So hence the attempt in whatever little I've written to understand how is this tension going to be understood, how is it going to be played out. Fortunately, I've stayed away from the political, let's say, noise as much as possible to focus on these questions, because remember, the other side operates in silence and they get the job done in silence. We believe in making a lot of political noise without undertaking policy changes. Politics is temporary, policy is long term, if you believe that civilization is long term. Your investment therefore has to be in policy. And therefore the horse behind which the cart is placed has to be policy, and politics must be a driver of that particular policy. We actually place the cart before the horse. We will celebrate every municipal election. We will celebrate every panchayat election without asking, has it changed the status quo on education? Has it changed the status quo on our own children rebelling against our culture? Has it changed a situation where beef consumption becomes normalized across parts of the country, when generations of our ancestors fought to prevent it? And today you have a situation where you have an advertisement with a couple walking into a restaurant where beef consumption is shown with Tyagaraja Kriti being played in the background. Imagine if this could have happened 150 years ago. That is the story of so-called Hindu resistance and how we are an independent society. We are being told you're independent because we tell you you're independent, but you will still follow the rules that we set about 150 years ago. For all the rebels among youth, you want to break the rule, break the colonial rule in your head. Thank you.
Jobin Thomas is an audiologist, and his question is, what exactly is democracy? Is it the representation of every ideology or the will of the majority?
So there's a very interesting discussion that happens across the world on why do you need to use the word republic in the context of a democracy? Why do you have democracy as well as republic? So I think there are three aspects to this. One, once you say it's a republic, you're trying to repel or dispel the notion that it is a monarchy. It's not. But the combination of a republic and democracy effectively means democracy, which is the will of the majority, can lead to complete silencing of non-majoritarian voices or minority voices. So a republican democracy envisages a situation where the legislative body is not just populated by people in the majority, but it is equally populated by people in the minority, so that there is some kind of a pushback between the majority and minority, and it is not seen as a brutal rule by the majority or a brute rule of the majority. So even I don't know how many chartered accountants are here, how many lawyers are chartered accountants. Anybody who runs a company or who understands how a company works knows that even in the Companies Act there are specific provisions that permit minority shareholders to approach the company law board or the company law tribunal alleging oppression and mismanagement of the minority by the majority. Which is to say, a democracy, if applied let's say in toto, as is where is, will have the effect of depriving any minority voice altogether. A Republican democracy means that you make sure that the government is in the hands of the majority with a check and balance in the form of a minority which will stand in the opposition or sit in the opposition. So that is the meaning of a Republican democracy. And the body in which this entire pushback plays itself out is the legislative body of the parliament. So hence, both typically are meant to go together. So it is possible for you to be democratic and still not be Republican, and therefore be majoritarian, anti-minority altogether. And I don't use the word minority in a religious sense, because the parliament does not use, or rather the constitution does not use the word minority in a religious sense. If you take a look at Article 29, you could just Google it up, anybody can do it these days. It specifically speaks of cultural minorities, linguistic minorities, or any section of the society. So for all practical purposes, a Sanskrit speaking population could be treated as a minority for the purposes of Article 29. Or a Tulu speaking population in a non-Tulu majoritarian state could be treated as a minority for the purposes of that state. And majority and minority are never to be understood from a country perspective. There are judgments on the point, and the constitution also indicates that to some extent. Those are questions to be addressed from a state to state perspective. Because you could be a national minority and you could be a local majority, Kashmir being a very good example of it. Next.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Mr. Vinit Narayana Shastri M, who is a student. Welcome, Vinit Narayan Shastri. And his question to you is, he says, Namaste Sai Deepak ji. How do you see the next 30 years of this country, given the fact that demographic change is happening rapidly and there is also the illegal immigrants problem? Government is not doing anything about that.
I think what the government is or is not doing is a legitimate question to ask, and I won't run away from it. But before that, just consider this. Hindus are in trouble when they're in a minority. They're equally in trouble when they're in a majority. So which government can save you if you don't have the guts to save yourself? That problem is further complicated by the fact that your trouble is not a political incentive for any government, enough for them to act on it. The next 30 years, I think we are in 2025. I previously said that another quarter of a century could be problematic. In my recent engagements, I have advanced the timelines to say we are looking at a 10 or 15-year problem, not a 25, 30-year problem anymore. And which means if you see repeated instances of demographic imbalance and you see someone constantly testing the waters to see what will the reaction be from the state, let's test the waters, that means someone already knows that they have the numbers plus the state does not have the will, nor the society has the will. I'm happy about rising awareness at least since 2014, or awareness which led to 2014 and thereafter. But it is translating at this point to an elitist awareness which does not have the will or the guts to do what it takes to get the job done, because it doesn't want to dirty its hands. And which means what will happen is you will continue to see lit fests flourishing. You'll continue to see more and more platforms discussing this. But will all of this translate to actual action is the question. If it remains a storm in a teacup, where people gather at a town hall or at a theater or a mega auditorium where they discuss all of this, then they are only reinforcing what they already know. What is the change that comes out of it? You may not know everything that I said today, but you broadly agree with what I've said. broadly, if not in specific. So, what is the change in the movement of the needle that I've achieved today? We are talking to each other and we already agree on quite a few things. How has this managed to bring about a change? Have we converted more people to our point of view? We are not sure of it. Two, will this lead to pressure on the government to act by way of resolutions to say that this audience believes that these are the following actionable points which you must implement in the interest of civilizational security? So one of the things that I've tried to convey in terms of a limited suggestion to multiple platforms is it's good to organize events, but you must also have actionable goals where the voice of your audience is communicated to the government along with their positions. Lit fests must have clear plans as to what are the issues that we want the government to address. The other side does this brilliantly. They do it brilliantly. Every lit fest, every platform, every organization will have a certain set of intellectuals whose names and credentials are used to write letters, to write representations, to castigate people, to criticize stuff. We have not learned that yet. Two, here's my limited prediction or assessment of how this is going to play out. Because of a young demographic which is hungry for technology and growth, all things being equal and we don't get sucked into the race to the bottom called the reservation battle, our economic future is decent. Decent. Unless we go back to the freebie model, we go back to the hyper reservation model and we kill everything that is possible. You can't speak of startups and competing with China in the same breath as reservations. I don't see how that works. Or at least unfettered reservations. Have some limits, respect the constitutional mandate of 50%, make sure that only the deserving community gets it, do away with the creamy layer. If you don't do that, this conversation is basically a conversation about India's doom. There is no way India will ever be a decent power to begin with. We are not even a middling power today. We are nowhere close to being a superpower. We are not even a developed economy. We are an aspiring developing economy which has been in this mode for the last 50, 60 years. Or maybe the last 20 years. Be realistic about where you stand. Because if you delude yourself that I've already reached a certain position, you will never reach there. Tell yourself that there's a long way to go. While this happens, even after the last 11 years since 2014, I have not seen a clear change in the DNA and the attitude of the Indian state in ruthlessly coming down on mischievous elements in the society. It still handles them with kid gloves. And it has no stomach for confrontation. It has a soft underbelly which is constantly being punched, and it has happened over the last, I think, at least since 2019, we've been seeing the streets in constant action and a constant fire mode. So change the definition of terrorism from bomb blasts to urban warfare or street warfare, because that is what it has changed into. Because you don't know how to hit a mob or you don't know how to deal with a mob. Plus, if it happens to have infants and women, that's it. God save us. Now, we don't know which God that will be. So, I don't see this as a particularly great period unless we change our approach and attitude. And we also develop the guts and the ability to articulate our position to detractors within and audiences outside. Have a very clear strategy of articulating your positions. Unfortunately, the last 11 years has been an example or a testament to a decent vision with average execution and terrible communication. That is not a recipe for a Vishwaguru at all under any circumstances. Address each of these aspects. We are not short on talent for this. There is a talent pool for this. And the problem is, if you choose to pass this problem as the problem to the next generation, with every successive generation, the pace of the problem and the magnitude of the problem is only increasing. And that is the problem that Indian democracy has been facing, that every generation believes that the next generation will handle, by which time the demographic imbalance only increases to your detriment. And previously it was some parts of the country, now it's all parts of the country. And we will still, again, coming back to this issue, we will constantly blame someone who was a prime minister from 47 to 63 as opposed to focusing on what is happening now. There's a time when you must draw attention to yourself and what you have done. There's a point when constantly pointing fingers to the past doesn't help. So the most boring, obvious, bone-sickening question that we get asked these days in literary fests is, how do we change history textbooks? And then a host of opinions will start. The Marxists did this, the Marxists did that, Nehru did this, Nehru did that, his grandfather did this. You go on saying this for 10 minutes. It made sense to say this in 2014. Perhaps it made sense to say this in 2019. It certainly makes no sense to say this in 2024. They did what they did. What have you done? It doesn't help to constantly draw attention to them, because then it seems like you're the opposition in power and they're the opposition in power in both ways. Rather, it's almost as if you don't know who is setting the narrative, who's in the treasury bench and who's in the opposition. And at least over the last 5 years, the most serious challenge that's going to emerge for Hindu Dharma, Sanatana Dharma and civilization is not going to be external, it's going to be internal. Because we are going to be bogged down heavily on caste-related issues, in caste-related reservations, and that's going to be a serious problem, very serious problem, which will weaken us and hollow us out, leaving us completely defenseless to the external challenge. And on this, as long as the conversation is sugar-coated, it's politically correct, without truth being the basis, some form of reasonableness being the basis, it is a conversation that will be majoritarian in nature, which means whoever has the ability to create trouble on the streets will ask for reservation, and then we are again 10 steps back. So reservation is no more a question that is based on reality. It is not even based on perceived reality. It is based on distortion of history and gross lies. True instances of serious oppression or discrimination, address them. Do address them. Because if you don't, then that entire population remains vulnerable to conversions, to proselytization. I get all of that. But the way forward is to teach people to survive, as opposed to make them self-reliant, as opposed to making them state-reliant. And somewhere you have to say, is there a cutoff date for this? Is there a point where we can say, okay, after this, some may not necessarily be beneficiaries of this particular, let's say, benefit? If someone asks me, what is the cutoff date for your reclamation of temples or occupied sites? I say, you tell me the cutoff date for reservation, I'll tell you the cutoff date for this. Somehow cutoff date becomes relevant when it comes to reclamation of temples, but there is no cutoff date whatsoever on the question of reservation. At least my cutoff date is in the past. Yours is worst, it's in the future. We seem to have two different standards on the question of jati and on the question of inter-community relations. The logic of a position that applies to intra-community reservation, in terms of trying to say that reservation must be there because it needs to address a social wrong in the past, or even perhaps a continuing social wrong in certain places, should equally apply to inter-community relations. The logic doesn't change because the overall issue is the same, addressing injustice, period. Why should the logic change? Next.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Sri Lakshmi, who is a law student. Welcome, Sri Lakshmi. So her question is, in Shabarimala judgment, it was stated that Hindus who worship women as goddess have sanctioned women on the matter of devotion. This observation is completely against all facts. So when Supreme Court makes such irrational observation, as an educated Hindu, how I am supposed to react? Will I be subjected to contempt of court proceedings?
No. Criticism of a judgment is completely par for course. There's nothing wrong with it. There are judgments to the effect that you can even criticize a judge, not just the judgment. The Supreme Court has said as much, that not every criticism of a judge is necessarily contempt of court. But if the criticism is meant to prevent him from doing justice or to handle a matter, that is where contempt of court begins. However, if assume for a moment the conduct of a particular member of the bench leaves a lot to be desired, criticism is perfectly justified. There are multiple judgments on the subject. Two, one of the problems of this original Sabrimala judgment of 28th of September 2018 was that sweeping observations were made. Sweeping observations were made that Hindu Dharma does not permit this, does not permit that. Please realize Hindu Dharma is an agglomeration of sampradayas, and every sampradaya has its own sets of rules. So you don't get to judge the practices of the Kamakhya temple based on the practices of the Kanchi Kamakshi temple. You don't get to judge Tirupati on the anvils of Padmanabha Swami temple, because these are they are different parts. Even in the tradition, they represent different parts of the Devi. They will have their own practices altogether. One may be left-handed, the other may be right-handed. One treats menstruation in a certain way, the other treats menstruation in a different way. You don't get to comment, because the very same Hindu diversity that you constantly celebrate for the sake of ornamental argument is represented in the diversity of practices. You can't say Hinduism is a diverse set of traditions and then apply a blanket rule for all temples across the board. So those blanket observations in the judgment reflect an institutional misunderstanding or lack of understanding of the diversity and depth of Hindu Dharma, Sanatana Dharma. That is therefore, according to me, the highest possible level at which we need decolonization, mental decolonization, serious decolonization. That they look at the traditions of this land through the lens of a tourist. Because when you go to a zoo or when you go to a foreign land, you're looking at those people as curious onlookers. They are the subjects of your study. But when you look at your own culture like a tourist, there's a mental problem. It's like looking at your parents through the lens of a neighbor. Makes really no sense. So, according to me, mental decolonization is seriously important, and the best part is finally several voices on the bench of the Supreme Court have started saying we need to decolonize our approach to the Constitution, we need to decolonize our approach to the judiciary, we need to decolonize our approach to institutions of this land who are unfortunately litigants before our courts. So there is some hope for change, but the judiciary can never be faulted in isolation, because the judiciary is a reflection of the society. It's not as if they have been parachuted from the heavens. They are from the society. And second, at least over the last 40 years, what has happened is, even if there is a diverse set of voices, some batting for the civilization within the Constitution and some speaking against the civilization under the pretext of the Constitution, certain set of voices have been constantly being given prominence. So they are called the narrative, and the others who oppose them are called counter narrative. Who said you are allopathy and Ayurveda? Why is Ayurveda not the mainstream? Why is allopathy not the counter narrative? So I think the good part of what has happened in the last 11 years is that voices of dissent have started challenging the status quo. And which is perhaps the reason that by the time the Sabrimala matter went for a reference to a 9-judge bench, read the 9 questions that have been framed for reference to the 9-judge bench. It is a reflection of introspection by the highest court of the land, saying, maybe on matters of religion, we may not know enough. We may not understand enough. So it is not up to a secular constitutional court to distill what is an essential religious practice of a place, because you may not know enough to determine what is essential and what is not essential. Those are the 9 questions which were framed through the review petition, 55 review petitions that were filed against the original Sabrimala judgment, and the reference is awaiting. And those questions clearly show why the original judgment was sent to review. Today, the practice of Sabarimala as it existed prior to the September 2018 judgment has been restored because of this very order. So to answer your question, fortunately, that institution seems to be still open to introspection and a change of perception when presented with the right kind of push. The operative word being not right, but push. So, what this Sabarimala movement tells me from a larger perspective is, no constitutional battle is a pure legal battle. It is also being fought in the court of public opinion. You want the latest example? Places of Worship Act. These are battles which are also being fought in the court of public opinion. I am not saying public opinion must necessarily influence judicial outcome, because they must stick to the black letter of the law, the position on merits, and do justice to it. But the public should not believe that they have no voice in this entire situation. They do have a voice. On the issue of same-sex marriage, if all LGBTQ groups have a right to speak on the judgment and criticize it left, right, and center, on the question of Sabarimala, why should devotees not have the same rights? Why are certain rights limited to a certain section of people because you think that they're oppressed and not others? So, you're not wrong. And let's end it on a positive note, that the institution is introspecting. And I know for a fact, where I happen to appear along with two other senior delegates, one is Mr. Satish Parasaran and another Mr. Sridharan, to represent Ahobilam Mutt before the Supreme Court when the Telangana government tried to take it over, and the local high court rejected the takeover. The Supreme Court finally started asking the question, what is the job of a secular state in a religious institution? Who are you to administrate? Why do you take control? So the constant speech or constant discussion on the subject has finally percolated to the highest level possible, where they're also asking this question, how is it that we have allowed all these years where institutions, religious institutions of a particular community are being controlled by an apparently secular state? That question is now surfacing. So sometimes the first battle in court may not result in success, but you must keep taking a shot at that particular issue in that particular institution, because kabhi na kabhi to change hoga. You want a simpler example? The first judgment of the Delhi High Court on the question of section 377 of the IPC was in favor of the LGBTQ community, to say that it should be decriminalized. When the matter goes to the Supreme Court, the first Supreme Court verdict was against the High Court judgment. Then when the matter was revisited, the opinion was changed. What happened in between? Advocacy by members of the community, trying to reach out to as many people as possible, presenting their point of view. I'm saying this is what the left does so well. For them, one defeat is not the end of the situation. They constantly attack, they constantly relentlessly pursue the cause, and they make sure that they publish articles, they publish books, they come out with videos. And they make sure that the thinking population has access to only their point of view through mainstream publications, which is what we need to learn. Relentless advocacy. That is the only way this goes forward. Next. Please don't be under compulsion to clap at everything.
Since there are a lot of students, especially law students, we are giving this privilege of having the last question from yet another student. Her name is Madhura K. Do we have Madhura K here? Welcome, Madhura. Her question to you is, sir, what would be your advice to students to build a better India based upon truth, given that we see every democratic machinery is riddled with narratives against the interest of this nation?
The thing about too much exposure to information is also too much exposure to negativity, and especially information that comes through social media platforms. I can confidently say, having been in this battleground for the last 8 years, is despite all the challenges facing us, I am still an optimist. And I've seen perhaps terrible times on campuses when I was a student. I've lived through 98, the no confidence motion in 96. I've seen Kargil. I've seen 9/11. I've seen 26/11. I saw the results of 2004 and its repercussions on campuses. I've seen and I've lived through all of that. And I can say any day today we are better off. Finally, we have a voice. These kind of platforms on such topics would have been unimaginable maybe even 5 or 10 years ago. This would be almost no-go. This would be considered harakiri for organizers. And today you're able to talk about these topics. You have an audience. So draw a leaf from X-Men. Mutants have finally found a place. And they're able to identify each other through social media platforms. And they're able to collaborate. A lot of my friends, I don't know them not from Adam, but not from Manu. And I know them only through social media platforms because of a common bond, which is ideological or cultural or civilizational. So I had two students walk up to me recently at the Pragjyotishpur Lit Fest in Guwahati that was held just a few days ago. And both of them come from as left an institution as it gets. It's the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. And they are from, I think, the Guwahati campus. Both of them know that they don't subscribe to the leftist ideology, but they are stuck in a campus that is virulently left and virulently anti-non-left. And they were looking for people to bond and at least survive in that place. Somebody was wearing the thread and the other realized this was wearing a bindi. They identified each other. And they started talking to each other. And they realized, oh, you're also from the same camp, huh? Okay. We will talk. And that's how they started building a resistance on the campus. When the anti-CA protests were raging in TISS and similar institutions, I know for a fact the number of emails I got from those campuses, from students, telling me, sir, you continue the fight outside, we will continue the fight inside. With consequences for their careers and their futures, they took out pro-CAA protest marches on the campus of TISS Mumbai. So a lot of students are risking it, going out on a limb and defending their positions openly, finally. My reading is actually different. I don't think we have been in the minority. We have just been a non-vocal majority. So it's like this, out of 100 people, 30 people have been shouting. Their narrative has become the mainstream. 30 people know that they want to shout. 30 people don't know which way to go. 10 people don't care. So once from the outside, someone like me or Anand or Vikram or anybody else says, we are here, start the fight. Start the battle. We will protect you legally. We'll give you the arguments, but don't back down. Don't back down. They did it. And that results in the rest of the 30 people thinking, where should we go? Now, out of them, some people might not have an opinion because of lack of knowledge. You give them knowledge and then we'll see what will happen. Some people are opportunists. They'll see which way the wind is blowing. Aaj Congress, us din BJP, now we'll see. So they'll try and balance those positions. What has happened is this 30 now has a vocal 30 to oppose it. And there's a proper split in the remaining 40, meaning thereby that nobody gets to say that campuses will stay left like Indian roads. No. Keep left will be a rule only on Indian roads, not on campuses anymore. That we are very clear about. So my job has been to go to these institutions and say, let's start a small fire here. Narayana, Narayana, we'll do this and go. And I've done that successfully and very proudly in the most anti-Hindu institutions. Those who have cancelled me have done a great job of contributing to the myth of JSD. And they have in the process demonstrated and betrayed their anti-free speech credentials, making it easier for me to accuse them of being fascists. You let me in, you lose. You don't let me in, you will still lose. Choice is yours.